For this lesson and the next few, we're going to talk about validation within web applications. And specifically, we're going to focus on server-side validation. What is validation, though? Validation is something you've seen before, actually all the time. You've experienced validation when, say, logging into a website or, say, entering a credit card that wasn't correct on a shopping site, entering a date or a number that was not correct. So we've all experienced validation errors where we entered data in and a website told us that our data was not valid for some reason or another. Either the passwords didn't match or the password doesn't have the right combination of special characters or things like that. So exactly what's happening when data is validated is a little bit more complicated than just that user experience that you see. And so we want to start off by just talking about validation a little bit in the abstract. So why do we validate form data? There's a few reasons. One is that we want to ensure that user-submitted data makes sense. So if, for example, your application required temperature data or a date or a time, those numeric values only make sense if they're in a given range. And so for the application to work well and for other assumptions that the application might make, we need to make sure that the data we get from a user is valid, that it makes sense when there are specific ranges or specific values that data should have. We also want to prevent users from submitting data that might break our application. So this could be something that's malicious. Somebody might, intentionally try to break our application, or it could just be an accident, right? So we want to make sure that no matter what the data is that the user submits, we as the programmer are prepared to handle anything they might send at us and to make sure that our application, rather than just sort of crashing and burning, responds appropriately. And validation also gives us an opportunity to present user-friendly feedback when data doesn't meet our criteria. So in the second bullet, we talked about, if somebody submitted data that didn't make sense for our application, it could break the application, maybe return a 500 error or something like that. Well, if we're actually doing our job correctly as programmers, we're able to catch those things before they actually result in errors and provide a much more user-friendly experience. We're also able to provide very specific contextual information about why their data didn't validate and to help them fix it and resubmit valid data. So we can validate data on the client or the server, the client just being the web browser, the server being where we're writing our Python code. And so client-side validation can happen in multiple ways. The most common are to use HTML input element attributes. And so this would be, say, adding type equals email to a field that needed to be an email address. You can also add various other types of attributes that we're not going to go into to validate the data within an HTML input form or input element. You can also use JavaScript to validate data. JavaScript could read the value of a form input before the form is submitted, make sure that it meets certain criteria, and then either allow that form to be submitted or stop submission and report an error to the user. The advantages of client-side validation are that data can be validated in real time. By that, I just mean when the user is there typing it in within the page. And so they don't have to go all the way to the server. They don't have to make a request. They don't have to submit the form in order for the data to be validated. It can be validated much more quickly. And so in that sense, it's much more user-friendly. The disadvantage is that client-side validation can be easily bypassed. A couple of ways that you can do that. You can disable JavaScript in a browser if the validation is happening within JavaScript. To bypass HTML input element validation, you can just submit a request in a different way. So there are different ways to submit HTTP requests to a server via Telnet or via creating your own form or any number of other ways. So people aren't bound to using the forms that we create to submit data to our servers, and so that could potentially, break our server code. Server-side validation happens in a couple of places, and we'll focus specifically on the first one, which is that we can validate data within our request handlers. So when we are writing request handlers in our Flask applications, we can write code to check the values of the data that was submitted and make sure that they were correct, and if not, report back to the user. We can also validate data within a model class, and this is something that we'll get a little bit into in Unit 3 if you go on to learn about Java or C# in the various skill tracks about how to validate data within model classes, and that's sort of just a separate concern. For us, we're going to focus on server-side validation within the request handlers. The advantages of server-side validation is that it can't be bypassed. So if somebody wants to make a request to our server, they have only the ways that we specify to do it. They can't bypass the specific handlers that we put in place. The disadvantage is that, as we said before, it's not that user-friendly. A request has to be submitted in order for data to be validated, so the user might spend a bunch of time typing in a bunch of data within the form, and they don't know it's wrong until they hit enter, and our server tells them that it's wrong, at which case, time has passed, and it's a little bit of annoying, and potentially they have to type in some more data again. So good and bad on both sides of the client and server-side validation equation. So where do we validate our data? If both client and server-side validation have downsides, then which is the best approach to data validation? And the answer is both. So you want to validate data at as many places as possible at each step of the user interaction with your application. And this will just ensure that you have just as solid of an application as possible, that it's going to be as secure as possible, it's going to be as user-friendly as possible. And the more places that you're validating data, the more checkpoints you have to make sure that you don't get bad data into your system and that you don't get errors generated from bad data. One thing that you should think about is that as a programmer, you should never assume that the data you're getting is valid and safe, even if you have validation measures in place elsewhere. So we talked about client-side validation, and so if you're adding validation code on the server, you shouldn't assume that, oh well, my JavaScript already validated this field, it must be okay, because that can be bypassed. You should always assume that somebody is going to try to break your application intentionally, or that they are going to inadvertently break it just because they don't know better. And so we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. All right, so that's the introduction to data validation. We'll go ahead and jump into some coding and see how to do this within our applications.